Hello, church family. How are you today? I'm sitting in the dark, and yes, it's for a purpose. Before I explain that to you, I want to remind you once again this Sunday we're celebrating Resurrection Sunday, and we're going to celebrate communion. And so I want to encourage you once again, if you haven't gotten it yet, to get your supplies, get some crackers, get some juice so that we can take communion together, so that we can celebrate what the Lord has done. Now, let's talk about why I'm sitting in the dark. I'm sitting in the dark because we are doing our Holy Week reflections, and this is Friday. And Friday is a day of gloom and despair and darkness. And so I thought how appropriate it would be if we were to have some sense of being in the dark. And so today our devotion is going to be a little bit longer because there's a lot more to cover. And I want to make sure that we have a good sense of where we're at. We're going to be covering Matthew chapter 26, the rest of it, and then Matthew chapter 27. And we're going to end with Jesus being buried. So, a couple of thoughts that I have that I want to share with you to give you a highlight on some of the things that have taken place. Since Thursday, they ate the Passover meal together, and Jesus instituted now what we call communion. So we no longer do the Passover, we celebrate communion because of what Jesus has done. He tells the disciples that his blood would bring the forgiveness of sins, and that's really, really significant for all believers to understand that what Jesus did, his life, the way he lived his life, extremely important, but his death, the shedding of his blood, brings forgiveness and remission of sin. And then after they have that conversation at the table about why they are celebrating the Passover and how things are going to change, and no one really fully recognizes that yet, Jesus then looks to Peter and he tells Peter that you're going to betray me, you're going to deny me. And Peter, like many of us, say, it will never happen. And yet we all know that it did, just as Jesus said that it would. And after that, time of discussion and betrayal and conversation, Jesus said, let's go to the garden. And so they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he spends time in prayer. And while he's praying, he wants the disciples to pray with him. This is a tremendously important time for what's about to take place. Jesus is keenly aware of the challenges that are ahead of him, that he's going to be killed, he's going to be betrayed. He knows what's going to take place, that physically it's going to be very demanding of him. And he is praying and he is having this last conversation with his Father, saying, if there's any way for this conversation to cause something different to take place, he says it this way. He says, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. And so after that season of prayer and realizing that the disciples can't stay up any longer, they're just too tired, after that, Judas comes and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. When Jesus is betrayed, he's arrested and he's taken to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is a religious court. And they are supposed to be about justice, but they're not really. How many of you know that sometimes we can get off course and the things that we think that we're doing that are right are not? And that's what happened here. These religious leaders who are supposed to be the leading authority and leading in the way that they live and the way that they think and the way that they honor God, they were incredibly far off in what they were trying to do. And so they want Jesus killed, but they don't have the power to do that. And so they send Jesus to Pilate. And ultimately, Pilate says that yes, Jesus can die. There's a lot that goes on that I'm just hitting just the minimal of the highlights here. And so Pilate, who's the governor, says yes, he can be killed, and a prisoner named Barabbas is released in his place. And that's a really powerful picture of what happens in our lives. We are Barabbas. We're the ones who deserve death, and yet Jesus takes our place. At the end of all of that, I would call, craziness. The next thing that we see happen in chapter 27 is Judas hangs himself. And let me tell you, that is terrible that Judas did that. He was so despondent that he hung himself. And, wow, what if only he would have waited a couple of days? Perhaps he would have turned to Jesus and received forgiveness, but he hung himself, and that's never an answer. The next thing we see is this mob of people who are gathered around Pilate at the court that Pilate has before Pilate has condemned Jesus. We know that that's going to happen, and the people are surrounding and they're influenced by their leadership, and they are saying to Jesus and to Pilate, crucify him, and they're shouting, crucify him. And Pilate finally relents and says, yes, he can be crucified. And so Jesus was crucified. He was put on a cross. His hands were nailed. His feet were nailed. And while he's in agony on the cross and he's dying, they take a spear and they thrust it into his side to speed up his death. And ultimately, Jesus dies. And after he dies, he's taken off the cross and he's placed in an empty tomb. And all of those who followed him, who loved him, were at a loss, and they were confused, and they mourned his death. And I want to read to you just here quickly, just a few verses out of chapter 27. And it says, as evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took his body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. And that's, what a powerful picture. They're in shock, they're in loss, they're in denial, really, that here is where they're at. They're in this place of desperation and desolation. There's so much confusion. And beyond the confusion, they're just mourning the loss of Jesus. Their friend, someone that they looked up to, someone that they loved, someone who had only done good. And they are mourning his loss. And that mourning of that loss is compounded by the confusion. We thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was the one. We thought he was the difference maker. And now he's dead. And it's so important for us to realize that Jesus had told them that this is what's coming. And yet they couldn't hear it. And I think that's true for us. Our reflection today is really many-fold, isn't it? So much has happened. But the one thing I want you to focus in on tonight is being in the dark. We know that Jesus is going to be raised from the dead. We know that because we know the end of the story. But if we could pause and think about our own sinfulness and how that leads us into darkness, if we could think about the confusion when we're in places that we don't understand and God is walking with us, and sometimes we feel like we're all alone and we don't understand what happens. We're in the dark. Much like the disciples, we don't understand what's taking place. And yet we know that something's good's going to happen, but we want to try to put that out of our mind. And so for tonight, Friday night, I want you to sit in darkness and I want you to contemplate the depth of your sin, the forgiveness of sin through Jesus' blood, the confusion, the worry, the angst that the disciples felt. We won't have a devotion on Saturday because we need to stay in darkness and be thinking about our own sinfulness and the things that Jesus did and the things that he endured so that we can have forgiveness of sin. Well, church, that's our reflection for today on Friday. We leave you not with a smile, not with cheer, but with sadness in our hearts, for Jesus has died. We'll see you on Sunday.